As U.S. presidential candidates differ on the future of Ukraine, is victory or surrender the better option? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is urging President Biden to sign on to his victory plan, while Republicans backing Trump ask Kiev to cede territory. Can Ukraine construct any clear strategy with its biggest backer so deeply divided? I'm Andrij Dobriansky, and today's Newsmaker is Ukraine's victory plan. President Zelenskyy has spent the last week walking the corridors of power in the United States. He's presented his victory plan to top U.S. officials, but his visit comes at a time when most eyes are on November's presidential election. He secured a nearly $8 billion aid package, but it's still not clear just how steadfast U.S. support will be going forward, with a number of U.S. Republicans claiming his visit amounts to election interference. Meanwhile, Russian troops continue making gains in eastern Ukraine, leading critics to say Zelenskyy's so-called victory plan is a victory in name only. Here's a look.
As Ukrainians at home battled the flames of another Russian attack in the southern province of Odessa, Ukraine's president was in Washington, pressing for more U.S. support.
Mr. President, can you bring an end to this war?
Of course we have to.
And Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he has a plan to do it by the end of the year, bolstered by a new tranche of American aid.
Today we have a new support package, $7.9 billion. This will be a great help. And I raised with President Biden the plan of victory. Today we are preparing to discuss the details to strengthen the plan.
Charting a course for Russian capitulation, Zelenskyy is expected to urge immediate action on a guarantee of NATO membership for Ukraine and a request for Washington to ramp up sanctions on Moscow.
Russia will not prevail. Ukraine will prevail, and we'll continue to stand by you every step of the way.
Ukraine's president will also be asking for permission to use long-range Western weapons against Russian targets in Russian territory. Even before Zelenskyy's White House meeting, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a nuclear threat against any such attacks.
We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression against Russia and Belarus as a member of the Union state. All these issues have been agreed upon with the Belarusian side, with the president of Belarus, including if the enemy, using conventional weapons, creates a critical threat to our sovereignty.
As it stands, Russia currently occupies around 20% of Ukrainian territory, highlighted in red. Moscow's immediate objectives center around consolidating complete control of the Luhansk and Donetsk provinces in Ukraine's east. Ukrainian forces are trying to place Russia under further pressure with its incursion north of Kharkiv into Russia's southern Kursk province. Ukraine's chances of winning what has become a war of attrition hinge on retaining Western support. But American backing for Ukraine to regain territory captured by Russia could very well be up against the clock, with decisive U.S. elections less than 6 weeks away.
There are some in my country who would instead force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory and would require Ukraine to forego security relationships with other nations. These proposals are the same of those of Putin. They are not proposals for peace. Instead, they are proposals for surrender.
It's not a surrender. What my strategy is to save lives. I want to save lives. I will say this. I believe I will be able to make a deal between President Putin and President Zelenskyy quite quickly.
But it's clear Ukraine's president has no intention of ceding any territory as part of a deal, with the hope victory will be won before the end of the Biden administration's one term in power.
So can Ukraine even execute a strategy with the political direction of the U.S. still unclear? Well, joining me now to debate that and much more are from New York, Director of Communications for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Andrij Dobriansky. From Moscow, former Russian diplomat Viacheslav Matuzov. And in Washington, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Andrij Dobriansky. Thanks all so much for being with me. Andrij, I'll start with you. This was really a pivotal visit for President Zelenskyy, but it's, like we said, still not totally clear if it was a win for Ukraine. So tell us what you think Zelenskyy got out of this visit, and if it is indeed a net positive.
Well, to be clear, this is not just a visit for America, but it was a visit with so many international world leaders, given that it was centered around United Nations General Assembly Week. So the fact that he was able to sit down with members of the Japanese government before the new prime minister was announced, with leaders of the American Organization of American States, as well as the European Union. So many leaders who, even leaders like the leaders of South Africa, who attended the peace summit in Switzerland in June, and have come back with questions from the side of Moscow. All people who are willing to stand with Zelenskyy publicly, speak with him, and encourage Ukraine towards this path to regaining its territory. What happened domestically in the United States, I think, was also a boon, because immediately at the United Nations, he met with a bipartisan delegation of American legislators. He not only has met with President Biden, with the candidate Vice President Harris, but even after some consternation, even a meeting with the Trump campaign. So I think that overall enormously positive, and I would cap it with that visit to Scranton, which is probably the first visit by a sitting world leader to an American munitions plant during war since Winston Churchill.
Right. Okay, Viacheslav, what did Moscow make of this visit?
Well, I don't think that Moscow can change their own decision made for many months ago, because Moscow is absolutely sure that no other way for Zelenskyy as a president of Ukraine to continue war with Russia, because we don't care much about the quality of military equipment sent from the West, mainly from the United States, to Ukraine. And I don't think that it will be influenced very definitely on our position, political, diplomatical position. So all these rumors, all this movement in the United Nations today, they don't can influence and don't can affect on Russian position at all. Okay. Because all the situation is developing on the ground, in the in the battlefield, and there it is absolutely clear for today that Ukrainian army is not ready to stop Russian deployment.
Yeah, let me ask Andrew then.
That it is,
because, yeah, I mean, Russia says very clearly there, no matter what is negotiated or in the United States, no matter who Zelenskyy wins with, no matter who Zelenskyy is speaking to and meeting with, on the ground, Andrew, Russia is winning. And you've said specifically, actually, the next 3 to 6 months are so crucial. So why? I mean, will we suddenly have real clarity on what the end game is supposed to be?
You're absolutely right. The next 3 to 6 months are crucial for Ukraine, especially as it continues to hold Russian territory in Kursk Oblast, giving the Kremlin a little bit of a taste of its own medicine. And President Biden, here's where I think Vyacheslav is wrong. President Biden yesterday announced $8 billion in new funding for Ukraine that will go toward more munitions, more materiel, and ideally allow Ukraine more air defense as well, and ideally allow Ukraine to strike military targets within Russia. That's something that the Biden administration has probably weighed for far too long. But I expect a decision is coming, and it should be, if the Biden administration follows the pattern that they have over the last 2.5 years, we should get the right decision after many months of internal hemming and hawing.
I'm wondering, though, quickly, Andrew, because, Vladimir Putin made clear mention of the fact that nuclear plants are not off limits. In fact, Zelenskyy himself warned that they will be a target. And we have the Ukrainian winter approaching, Russian winter, of course, as well. Is that a game changer in your 3 to 6 month timeline here? Is that factoring into what Ukraine will have to do strategy-wise if they want to pull off this victory plan that they proposed?
Absolutely. I think, the winter is going to slow down the fighting a little bit just because, that's the nature of things. But of course, in a kinetic sense, I should say, in terms of advances with soldiers, it's just more difficult to do that. But of course, long-range strikes can certainly happen. Drone attacks can happen. And I think the more Ukraine gets in terms of materiel, the better it's able to recruit in the next few months. Will prepare it even better for when things, probably will heat up again in the spring on the battlefield.
Okay. Andrij, let me come back to you, though, because you might dispute this, but many are saying that everything U.S. politicians do right now will have to be connected to their campaigns. So overall, is that good or bad for Ukraine?
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that assessment. I obviously don't agree with the assessment of certain Western analysts when they said Ukraine would fall in 3 days, 3 weeks. It's been nearly 3 years. Or the downplaying of the Kursk offensive, which now has expanded past 2 months. So similarly, people's assessment about how the United States political campaign will affect support for Ukraine. We heard that just this week with some members who are adamantly in the camp of supporting whatever Donald Trump says, even though he may change his mind from day to day. For instance, this week he declined a meeting with Zelenskyy, then he changed his mind, and he is going to have a meeting with Zelenskyy. I think we saw from the heads of several important committees, we saw senators like Roger Wicker, Tom Tillis, Senator Dan Sullivan, who met with Zelenskyy in New York. These are all Republicans of a certain high rank within the Senate, and they all dismissed whatever poo-pooing of Ukraine was happening within their own party. I frankly think we're going to see what we see every time, whether it's an American election or my experience in Poland last year, right before the Polish election. A lot of campaigning, a lot of hot rhetoric happening before the election, and then right back to business immediately thereafter.
Okay, let me ask Viacheslav then. I mean, how much... I know Russia, the way it's been expressed, especially on this program through the Russian representatives we've had, is that Russia really doesn't take any Western analysis into consideration. So I'm assuming it's the same when people talk about what difference this U.S. election will make. But really, when you look at what candidates Trump and Kamala Harris are saying, one is many analysts accuse Trump of actually being pro-Russia. Kamala Harris herself has said that he is pro-Putin. So does this matter to Moscow, really? How important is this election coming up in respect to the policy on Ukraine and U.S. support for it?
Well, I don't think that Russian military command pay any attention to development on the American political scene, because all the military plans are developed according to military goals put by command in the field. We watch very attentively of all developments in the center front, in the southern front, in the north front. All day we knew about the new progress in military action of Russian forces in all directions. Now it is under question the future of Ugledar. It is very important railway place for Ukraine, who are supplying Ukrainian army with arms from the West. If now the battle is continuing in this city, very important city, and as we saw in all military sources now, some special Russian forces entered the Ugledar center, and they are fighting in the streets. I don't think that there will be, and now surrounding forces, about tens of military staff of Ukrainian army is surrounded. And they are now trying to get out of this from Ugledar. And that what is a big problem for Ukrainian command. How to help their staff to leave the Ugledar as a city, because they are surrounded. There is no support of equipment, of rockets and guns and so on. So I think that the situation is developing in the interest of Russian Federation. I don't see any opportunity to begin diplomatic or political decision.
I want to talk more about the diplomatic decision in a minute, Vyacheslav. But let me just carry off on what you just said with Andrew here, because fine, Russia can be indifferent to U.S. politics, whatever candidates are running, because for Russia, everything is spoken on the battlefield really only. Ukraine doesn't really have that luxury, if I can put it that way. So at present, how fine of a line does Ukraine have to walk between demanding the kind of aid they need to continue execute their victory plan, and then not angering or offending their supporters by being too demanding? I mean, the level of diplomacy is so key here for Ukraine. How careful do they have to be?
Andrea, forgive me, I actually think it's the opposite. The Russians are the ones spending millions of dollars to try to influence U.S. politics. I mean, we just uncovered a $10 million disinformation operation funded by Russian intelligence with an attempt to destabilize American society, especially online and especially on the right wing. And so, perhaps Vyacheslav is correct in that the Kremlin doesn't have a preferred candidate, but they're absolutely trying to sow discord and influence our political process. And we know that because their intelligence services are spending millions of dollars to do so. As for Ukraine, actually, the coalition of support for Ukraine in the United States is incredibly wide across the political spectrum. And I think we saw that on Zelensky's visit. I mean, he met with, as Andriy talked about, President Biden, former President Trump, Vice President Harris, bipartisan leaders from both houses of Congress. I mean, the coalition really is quite strong and bipartisan, has been for the last not only 2.5 years, but many years before that. And one final point, back this spring when Congress was debating this supplemental for Ukraine, $60 billion for Ukraine and also for Israel and for Taiwan, there was a lot of fear that, some Republicans, if they voted for it, they might get some backlash in their districts. And 100+ Republicans in the House voted to pass the supplemental to support Ukraine, and all of them won their primaries this fall. None of them paid a political price, which I think also shows that the American people support Ukraine just as much as their elected officials do. Okay.
But it's interesting, though, Andrew, because what I was saying was that Ukraine has to work very hard on the diplomatic measures here in a way that Russia doesn't, because what you are describing is kind of more of a sabotage strategy that we've seen Russia execute in elections before. It's not so much about diplomacy, it's about destabilizing an enemy, period, regardless of what is happening necessarily in Ukraine, is it not?
Well, of course, diplomacy is important. And, Ukraine, I think, has done an incredible job, not only coordinating with the United States, but with 50+ partners in the U.S., North America, and in Asia as well. And Russia, frankly, has talked about diplomacy at points, but has really shown very little interest in doing that. And so I think, in part, you are right that Ukraine has had to be more careful. They've had to do more work, but they've had really phenomenal results and been able to mobilize a coalition behind them.
It's interesting, Andrea, because I could see you agree when Andrew said that the U.S. public is actually behind Ukraine, but we also know the U.S. public, a large proportion of it does support Trump. And Trump has said, that there is no point in funding Ukraine because Russia beat Hitler, Russia beat Napoleon, and they're going to win again in this fight. So the negotiations need to start now if there's anything possible to negotiate over, because Russia doesn't necessarily seem interested. So I'm wondering, how much longer can Ukraine fight, given that could be the political landscape of the United States if Trump were to win the election?
Well, that goes to the heart of what Ukraine has been talking about with other countries, with their alliance members. They are interested in winning the war. The people who have been helping, the countries who've been helping Ukraine, have been interested in stopping Russia's advance from taking over Ukraine fully. So there's a radical difference in that. I think in the eyes of the press that the regular people get to read and understand what's happening in Ukraine, they may take the top line numbers of what is promised to Ukraine. And then, as President Zelenskyy says, we're promised enough equipment for 14 brigades, we get enough for 2. So there's a dissonance between what has actually come to Ukraine and a dissonance between what the rhetoric is about standing by Ukraine for as long as it takes, as opposed to what's actually been delivered. And that's the difference of what Ukraine would like to see. That is what President Zelenskyy has made very clear in his visits, especially this past visit, not only with the leadership of the executive branch of the United States, but as well as the legislators. We need to allow Ukraine to strike back now, especially countering those kinds of jets and bombers that took off last night and killed people in Odessa, the previous night killing people in Kharkiv, all these civilian targets. If Ukraine was given the permission, they would this conflict would finish much quicker if Ukraine was able to take out the deployment, the areas where these bombers and these missiles are fired from. And then, as Ukraine has offered time and again over 200 instances of diplomacy over the last 10 years, Ukraine is calling again for another peace summit in late November, early December, to hash this out on the world level. It's got to be a joint, not just Ukraine, Russia, but in their neighbors, other countries in the world, countries like Kenya, who demanded that when Ukraine was invaded, that we have to respect international boundaries or the whole system comes down. It's going to take everybody at the table to finish this conflict, but it will include figuring out a way of having justice after this. And I think the ICJ will be involved in that definitely for many years to come.
Okay, interesting. I mean, we're down to our final minutes now, so let me go back to Viacheslav, because arguably, this all will come down to some sort of negotiation at the end. And because we've heard both sides pitched numerous times on this program about negotiations from the Russian perspective, I'll ask you now, at this point, is Russia really interested in negotiation? Like I said, we've had it back and forth here, and there's this argument that Russia is fixated on making Ukraine still pay for the failure to accept an original proposal to negotiate territory between Donbass and Crimea. The original rejection is still what Russia is going to make them pay for by refusing negotiations now. So, Vyacheslav, where does the prospect of negotiations even stand with Russia?
Well, before I answer your question, I could state that all this crisis in Ukraine began 2 years ago, began not from the goal of Russia to capture any Ukrainian soil. We can understand very clearly that in April 22, the Russian Federation suggested to Ukrainian government, and they signed from both sides, Russian and Ukrainian sides, in Istanbul, signed the agreement that will be approved by their parliaments and their presidents. They signed this agreement in Istanbul and departed. Russian delegation returned to Moscow, Ukrainian to Kiev. What we had, and this agreement consists of approval from Russian side, having all the regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, all of regions now included in Russian Federation should be the regions belonging to Ukrainian state.
Okay, we only have
Ukrainian
30 seconds
state
left.
Refused.
We know that's the history according to Russia, but will Russia enter negotiations now?
We are with negotiations, but on what base? Zelenskyy plan that not unclear, not only for us. The American doesn't have clear understanding what Zelenskyy peaceful plan means.
Okay.
Russia has all points registered very clearly, very openly, that no NATO presence in Ukraine, neutral state of Ukrainian state, not endanger Russian national security, and Russia was ready to give all this, and this future of
And again,
Crimea
as you can see on our screen
was
right now,
put
the question
on
still about Ukraine joining NATO
refused
is
not by
factoring
Ukrainians.
into this equation.
Ukrainians lost their independent position.
Vyacheslav Matuzov, very unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt it there because we are completely out of time. I know there is so much more to talk about and explain, but the clock is against us as usual. So thank you, all three of my panelists, so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrij Dobriansky. We will see you next time.